Every empire swears its money is safe. Every government promises its reforms will bring prosperity. In 19th century Japan, those promises came wrapped in silk, steel, and steam. In 1868, Japan was still, in many ways, a semi-feudal archipelago paid mostly in rice. Samurai carried stipends, peasants carried burdens, and wealth was measured in how many koku of rice a domain could theoretically produce, not how much capital it could raise on a bond market. By 1910, that same country was an industrial and military power with railways, textile mills, steel foundries, and a modern banking system, able to fight wars abroad and negotiate loans in London and other financial centers. That kind of transformation doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen just because people cut off their top knots or adopt Western uniforms. It requires something most history books reduce to a footnote, a complete demolition and rebuilding of the money system. Today, the polite word is modernization. At the time, for the people living through it, it felt like a shock. A money shock. Old currencies wiped out, samurai stipends erased, peasants suddenly pay taxes in hard cash instead of rice. A government that barely existed a decade earlier, now borrowing, printing, and spending like an ambitious European empire. The story is usually told as a political revolution, a cultural awakening, a technological leap. But underneath all of that is a more uncomfortable question. How do you finance a modern state when you're starting from rice, swords, and regional loyalties, and you owe money and obligations to people who don't even believe your new regime is legitimate? To answer that, it helps to go back to the world the Meiji leaders inherited. For over 2.5 centuries under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan's economy ran on a strange hybrid, rice as power, coins as convenience. Samurai were paid in koku of rice, a unit roughly equal to what it took to feed one person for a year. Domains were ranked by their rice output on paper, not by their tax receipts in cash. Merchants and townspeople used silver and copper coins in the markets, but beneath the surface, wealth remained agricultural and feudal. The system wasn't efficient, it wasn't modern. It leaked and creaked in all the ways pre-industrial economies do, but it had one advantage. It was stable. Then, in the mid-19th century, that stability shattered. Commodore Perry's black ships forced Japan open to foreign trade. Western silver and gold poured in. Exchange rates between Japanese coins and foreign currencies were badly misaligned. Japanese gold coins in particular were dramatically undervalued abroad. Foreign merchants could take Japanese gold out of the country, melt it down and profit, while sending cheaper silver back in. Slowly, quietly, precious metal drained away. Inside the country, prices started to wobble. Outside, the great powers looked at Japan and saw a semi-isolated state with weak money, unequal treaties, and weaker guns. When the Meiji Restoration toppled the shogunate in 1868, the new government inherited more than a throne. It inherited a mess, a patchwork of local currencies, semi-independent domains with their own debts and paper notes, samurai expecting lifelong stipends, peasants taxed in rice at rates set generations earlier, in a world where modern meant railways, rifles, navies, and telegraphs. Almost all priced in foreign currency, Japan struggled to obtain. Modernization was not a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival, but modernization has a price tag, and Meiji Japan started almost broke. If you want to build a modern state, the first tool you need is not a battleship, not a factory, not a constitution. You need a single, believable unit of value. By the early 1870s, Japan lacked that. There were dozens of circulating coins. Domain notes had been issued by local lords to paper over deficits. Some of those notes traded at a discount. Some barely traded at all. Trust was local, not national. The Meiji leadership decided to scrape this patchwork away. They abolished the domains and replaced them with prefectures. It was a political shock. But the real power move was monetary. In 1871, they introduced a new national currency, the yen. On paper, the yen looked clean and modern. A decimal system modeled on Western currencies. An official connection to precious metal, issued by central authority instead of feudal lords. It was not just a unit of account. It was a statement. There is now one state, and it decides what money is. In reality, the transition was messy and painful. Domain notes had to be redeemed. Old currencies had to be retired. People who had lived their entire lives under one set of tokens and promises were told that those promises would be bought out, converted, and retired, often on a timetable they did not control. The state had seized control of the unit of value, but it had not created any new wealth. It had simply created clarity, and clarity is dangerous because once you can measure, you can tax. Once you can tax in a unified currency, you can borrow against that future tax stream. Meiji Japan was about to do both. Under the old system, the samurai class lived off hereditary stipends, mostly denominated in rice or equivalent value. These stipends were obligations of the domains. When the domains were abolished, those obligations became, in a sense, obligations of the new Meiji state. On spreadsheets, it looked like a huge recurring liability. In political terms, it was worse, a large armed privileged class being paid to exist in a world where guns and bureaucrats mattered more than swords and lineage. The new government wanted railways, factories, schools, and a modern army and navy. It did not want to spend most of its budget paying warrior aristocrats to do nothing in a cash-based economy, so it engineered a solution that was logical in theory and brutal in practice. Samurai stipends were commuted, bought out and converted into government bonds. The pitch sounded respectable. No more unstable rice payments, no more dependence on domain administrators. Instead, interest-bearing securities backed by the new central state. In practice, it meant something far harsher. The government converted an open-ended flow of obligations into a fixed pile of paper debt. Samurai were now bondholders instead of income recipients. They could collect interest, yes, but many had little experience managing financial assets. And when the new cash economy bit into their daily costs, quite a few ended up doing the only thing they could, selling their bonds at a discount just to survive. Who stood ready to buy those bonds? Merchants, financiers, and emerging industrialists, people with ready cash, connections to officials, and an instinct for opportunity. The seeds of the future zaibatsu were watered not just with state contracts, but with discounted paper sold by a dispossessed class. In one stroke, the Meiji state had eased a massive political problem and begun a steady transfer of wealth and influence away from hereditary warriors toward a new elite aligned with capitalism, industry, and national development. On the surface, this was fiscal reform. Underneath it was a controlled implosion of the old social order, executed through the bond market. At the same time, the government turned its eyes to the countryside. A modern state needs reliable, predictable revenue. You cannot build steel mills and shipyards on sporadic in-kind rice tribute. In the early 1870s, Meiji leaders rolled out one of their most important and least appreciated reforms, the land tax overhaul. Instead of taking a fluctuating share of the rice harvest, the state fixed land taxes as a cash payment based on the assessed value of the land. For officials, this was rational. It stabilized revenue. It created clearer property rights. It made budgeting possible. For farmers, it was something else entirely. They now had to sell part of their harvest on the market, convert it into money, and come up with a tax payment in yen, whether the harvest had been good or bad. In a good year, it felt like a new kind of pressure. In a bad year, it felt like a trap. The tax did not automatically shrink because the rains failed. The state's claim was in cash, and it was inflexible. Japan's peasantry, from that moment on, was locked into a monetized national market. Their survival depended not just on the weather, but on prices in distant markets, the honesty of local middlemen, and the strength of a currency they did not control. The Meiji government now had something precious, a stable, cash-denominated flow of income. It could service bonds, finance public works, and present itself to foreign creditors as a serious borrower. But that stability came at the cost of rural stress, dispossession, and a rising sense of unfairness, especially when the next shock hit. Modernization is rarely a straight line. Meiji Japan's finances swung from scarcity to excess and back again. In the 1870s, to fund wars, suppress rebellions, and build modern infrastructure, the government reached for the easiest lever, the printing press. It issued large amounts of inconvertible paper money. Inflation rose, prices climbed. The same state that had dragged farmers into a cash tax regime watched that cash buy less and less. By the early 1880s, confidence in the currency was wearing thin. That's when a new figure stepped in. Matsukata Masayoshi, the finance minister whose name would become synonymous with deflation and pain. His mission was simple on paper and difficult in real life. Stop the inflation, stabilize the currency, and make Japan look like a disciplined partner in the emerging global gold standard system. The tools he used were familiar to anyone who has watched austerity anywhere in the world. He slashed government spending, he raised certain taxes, he sought to reduce the paper money supply. He sold state-owned factories and enterprises to private hands, many of which ended up in the portfolios of the same families who had been buying distressed assets for years. It was called rationalization. To the people living through it, it often felt like suffocation. Prices fell, credit tightened. For urban elites, that meant a stronger currency and a more respectable position abroad. For the countryside, it meant something else. Crop prices declined faster than debts and tax claims. Families who were barely hanging on under the new land tax system suddenly found their income shrinking, while their fixed obligations remained. Land sales, foreclosures, and distress became common. Again, someone was waiting on the other side of those forced sales. Merchants, landlords, moneylenders, and emerging industrialists had the liquidity to buy land, collateral, and assets on favorable terms. The result was a wave of consolidation. Rural society tilted. More families became tenants instead of owners. More young people drifted into factory work because the village could no longer support them. The Matsukata deflation stabilized the yen and pleased foreign creditors, but it also deepened the funnel that moved resources from the many to the few, and from countryside to city. Modernization now had not just an elite, but also a labor force. Japan's rise, however, was not financed only by internal reforms. It was also financed by something darker, war. In 1894, Japan went to war with the Qing dynasty in the First Sino-Japanese War. The victory was a watershed. It signaled that Japan was no longer a peripheral player. But beyond prestige, it came with something very concrete, a large indemnity payment from China, denominated in gold. That indemnity was a financial jackpot. It provided the Meiji state with foreign reserves. It allowed it to strengthen the backing of its currency. It helped fund railways, military expansion, and heavy industry. And, crucially, it gave Japan the confidence and the reserves to fully adopt the gold standard in 1897. Joining the gold standard was more than a technocratic choice. It was a declaration to the world. Japanese money would now behave like British money, metal-backed, disciplined, serious. With that move, Japanese bonds became more attractive in London and other financial centers. Investors, who might have hesitated to lend to a soft money, inflation-prone, semi-feudal state, now saw a country with a hard-pegged currency, rising tax revenues, and a track record of victory. Foreign capital began to flow more freely. War, in this case, was not just a military strategy, it was a financial pivot. As the state stabilized its currency and tapped both domestic and foreign capital, something else solidified: the relationship between the government and a small number of powerful business groups. The Meiji state built factories, shipyards, and railways, especially in the early phases. Later, it sold or transferred many of them to private families and companies that were politically reliable, financially capable, and willing to align their business strategies with national goals. Names like Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Yasuda became shorthand for integrated industrial financial empires. Mines, banks, shipping, trading houses, heavy industry under the control of a few dynasties. These were the zaibatsu. They grew large in part because they stood at the junction of policy and opportunity. They bought discounted assets from the state when policies changed. They acquired bonds and land when other people were forced to sell. They received lucrative contracts as the government built railways, ships, and armaments. They had easier access to foreign currency, technology, and credit. On the surface, this was privatization, development, entrepreneurship. Underneath, it was a tight alliance between political power and capital. The Meiji Money Shock was not a single event. It was a cycle. The state reshaped money and taxes. Crisis followed, assets changed hands, and a more concentrated, more aligned ownership structure emerged, ready to be harnessed for the next round of expansion. The revolution people like to remember is the visible one. New clothes, new institutions, new slogans. The deeper revolution lay in who held the claims on future income, who controlled the levers of credit, and who got to buy when others were forced to liquidate. When people talk about financing a modern Japan, it is tempting to imagine foreign investors writing big checks, or technocrats smoothly nudging policy dials. The reality was harsher. Financing came from unified currency backed by the state's willingness to invalidate old promises. It came from land taxes that pulled the countryside into cash. It came from commuting old stipends into bonds and then letting those bonds fall into new hands. It came from printing money to survive short-term crises, then crushing the resulting inflation with deflationary pain. It came from indemnities extracted after war, and from loans raised abroad on the back of a hard-pegged currency and a disciplined, if sometimes ruthless, fiscal stance. The winners were those who understood that money is not neutral. It is a tool of policy. They read the direction of change earlier than others. They had the networks to access credit when it was scarce, and the courage, or coldness, to buy when others had no choice but to sell. The losers were those who held claims tied to a vanishing world. Hereditary stipends, local currencies, small plots of land with taxes fixed above what the market could bear. The pattern is not unique to Japan. Meiji? Japan simply compressed it into a few decades and made it unusually visible. When a state decides it must transform, industrialize, arm, pivot its economy, it tends to reach for the same playbook: redefine the money, lock in a reliable tax base, convert lingering obligations into new financial instruments, use crisis as a pretext to accelerate change, channel assets into the hands of those aligned with the new order, then present the outcome as natural progress. The symbols of Meiji are easy to remember: samurai in Western suits, steam trains cutting through misty valleys, factories glowing in cities that once slept at sundown. The mechanisms are easier to forget: bonds swapping hands at a discount, farmers pushed into a cash economy they couldn't escape, policy-driven inflation followed by intentionally engineered deflation, indemnities flowing in after war and flowing out again through steel, ships, and subsidies. What survives a money shock in any country, in any century, is not just those with gold or land. It is those who understand that monetary reform, tax reform, and stabilization are never neutral. They decide who holds the claims on the future and who gets written out of the story. Meiji Japan did not just build railways and battleships, it built a new financial architecture and used it to choose who would rise with the new Japan and who would be sacrificed to it. The next time a government announces a bold monetary reform, a necessary stabilization, a once-in-a-generation tax overhaul, it is worth asking the same quiet questions that hang in the air over Meiji Japan. Who is being cushioned? Who is being squeezed? Who will be forced to sell and who will be waiting to buy? If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.